Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Public Opinion Part 2. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So in Part 1, we talked about the nature, the formation of public opinion. We talked about political ideology, and we went over some key differences between red and blue states, or Republican and Democratic states. In Part 2, this presentation, we're going to focus on primaries and general elections. I'm just going to go over that briefly, the measurement of public opinion, and the general knowledge and information that the public has. So let's talk about what a primary is. A primary looks like this. You have Republicans and Democrats. Each party is running its own primary. Now, you'll have a series of candidates for each primary, okay? So the Republicans, these four candidates will all compete against each other, all right? And there'll be party-based debates, and there'll be negative advertising, and there'll be all kinds of stuff, and it'll be these four all against each other. The Democrats will have their own separate primary election where well, it could be more than four, it could be 10, could be 3, could be any number of people, but I'm just sticking with 4 for brevity's sake. So these four candidates will compete against each other. This is a primary election. What exactly are they competing for? Their party's spot in the general election. So let's say, for argument's sake, that candidate 2 won in the Republican primary and candidate 4 won in the Democratic primary. That means that in a general election where most people vote, you have a choice between candidate 2 and candidate 4. So as you can see, we actually have a lot of options of who to vote for. The problem is people don't vote in this. They vote in this. And if, ladies and gentlemen, if you're showing up only at the general election, your choice has been virtually made for you because you are not participating in the very important first part of the election process. Now, so when we're talking about measuring public opinion, we need to talk about the ways that we do that. So the first method of measuring public opinion were these early polling efforts that started in the 19th century, the 1800s. They were known as straw polls. These were unrepresentative samples. Let me give you an example of how this works. So you get a bunch of people in a room that were, trying to choose their party's representative in the general election, right? You got a bunch of people in a room, and you've got a few guys standing on the side just walking up to random people saying, "Who do you support?" And they'd write it down. "Who do you support?" They write it down. Then they'd say, "Oh, according to the straw poll, everybody or most people supports this guy." Now, here's the problem. They're not going out into the rest of the country. They're not going into coffee houses or libraries or salons or anything like that. They're not going and talking to other people. They're only talking to the people who felt it important enough to attend this political event. So it was very unrepresentative. Now, after World War I, we started the era of scientific polling. And what this means is we started having probability-based polls or mathematical principles of probability applied to polling. And this is where scientific polling started. Now, who uses polls? Primarily politicians and the media as well. So, how do politicians use polls? So they do these three things. They have crafted talk, focus groups, and push polls. Crafted talk is the packaging of policies that appears mainstream but plays to a particular base of voters. So they'll talk, the Republicans, because they tend to not like taxes, they will talk about the death tax. And even though it appears as though they're talking about a mainstream topic, the taxes, what they're focusing in on is a tax that they particularly do not like, that their base does not like. Whereas Democrats would refer to it as the estate tax. Now, focus groups are groups of people that are brought together to share their opinions. So politicians and political talking heads will get together these groups of people and they'll share information with them. That they'll talk about different policies and they'll see how that group reacts to the policies. And it'll be everything from wording of a policy to the substance of a policy. And this is used to gauge public opinion and also to try to influence voters to think in a certain way. If the Republicans know that calling the estate tax the death tax is going to make people more likely to not like the tax, then they're not going to use the term estate tax. They're going to use the term death tax. Push polls present biased information that is designed to push voters to think or vote in a certain way. The goal of this is to manipulate public opinion. So a push poll might work something like this. Do you support the idea that upon your death, the government takes all your money, that they tax you right when you die, the death tax? Do you like the idea of that kind of tax? Well, that doesn't sound good. That sounds terrible. So everybody's going to say no to it, right? But if you have a poll that says the estate tax is a tax on a person who has died trying to pass on money to children or somebody else, do you support the government being able to tax that as income? Now, you may still not like the tax. You may still disagree with the tax, but the wording of the first option is drastically different than the wording of the second. Media uses these three things: tracking polls, they look at the Bradley effect, and they participate in exit polls, or they run exit polls. Tracking polls are when a small group of people are isolated. They're isolated by the media, where they are polled at various intervals, at various points during the campaign, to see if voter support or voter opinion has changed. All right. The Bradley effect is the discrepancy between polls that are taken and people's the actual voting that takes place. So white people like to say they support black candidates, but in a lot of cases, they don't vote for the black candidate. They say that they will or that they did, and then they don't. So this results in the discrepancy between polls and actual voting. Exit polls are done on election day, and people stand outside and they poll every 10th person and ask them how they voted. And this is usually done by networks and newspapers to try to predict who the winner of the election is going to be. So how do we construct public opinion from surveys? It's important to note that public opinion polls are scientific instruments, all right? They are based on data, all right? Now, to determine the accuracy of a poll, it has to be based on a representative sample of the population. And the validity of the poll, whether or not the poll is any good, depends on the sampling procedure used. Is it a large versus a small sample? And are different groups represented? All right, that includes gender, race, age, income level, etc. There are tons of different groups that we could poll. And it's important that you understand that straw polls are not representative polls. They are not scientific. They are not representative. All right, what are the problems with polls? Now, these are fun. You have the good citizen response, the bandwagon effect, inconsistent responses, push polls, and survey wording. Now, the good citizen response is you want to sound like you know what you're talking about. You want to please the pollster. So you basically try to figure out what the pollster wants from you, and then you give it to them. It's not actually an honest response. The bandwagon effect. You like it because everybody else does. So because a particular candidate is polling well, you now like them too. Inconsistent responses. Say, for example, you say you want to care for the poor on one particular question, and then 5 questions down the line, you say you don't want to raise any taxes to pay for it. So that's an inconsistent response. A push poll, which we talked about previously, questions are worded to push the respondent in a specific direction. And then survey wording. I mentioned the example of the death tax versus the estate tax, but the Affordable Health Care Act versus Obamacare is also a prime example. Depending on the connotation, the vibe you give to a certain policy or candidate will modify how the respondents respond. So, sampling a few, predicting to everybody. There is this statistical theory of sampling that states a sample of the population selected by chance is representative of that population. This is the prevailing theory of how we poll. Now, there are some key factors that affect the accuracy of that sample, okay? They have to be chosen randomly. Larger samples tend to be more accurate, and the greater variation you have in population means the greater the chance for differences in the ability to predict. So these are important, these 3 factors that affect the accuracy of a representative sample. Okay, now, polls. Let's look at the differences. So straw votes. A straw vote is a method of polling that seeks to read the public's mind simply by asking the same question of a large number of people. Who do you support? In the middle of some political event would be an example. It's highly unreliable, and we generally don't pay much attention to these right now. However, straw polls are still performed right now. Scientific polling got its birth in the 1930s. More than 1,000 national and regional polling organizations with at least 200 polling political preferences at this point. So it's grown from the 1930s. It starts very simple, and then now we've got literally thousands of people that participate in scientific polling. All right, so how do we evaluate polls, and what's their limit on public opinion? So polls are reliable, but they are not perfect. There are several potential problems. They can't measure intensity or stability. The relevance of the opinions they report can be suspect. And polls and pollsters are sometimes shape the opinions they are supposed to actually measure via push polls, for example. So we're trying to get an objective understanding of this. And if the pollsters use push polls, it's not objective at all. It's very subjective. Now, limits on the impact of public opinion. Public opinion is the major, but not the only influence on public policy. Because if it was, several things would be different in this economy. Public opinion says that income inequality is a major, major issue. Has anything been done about it? Let me think. No, nothing's been done about it. So it's a major, but not the only influence on policy. American political system is designed to protect minority interests against majority views and actions. My guys, we learned about this in Federalist 10, the problem of faction. The idea is if you have a majority faction, a majority group that is seeking to undermine the rights of a minority, they are going to win if we were based off a majority rule society. So our system was designed to protect the minority against that. Let me remind you that during the era of segregation, the vast majority of Americans supported it. Even though it was wrong, even though it was unconstitutional, most people thought it was a pretty good thing. So it's important that we understand our political system is designed to prevent that or to try to stop it if it's already occurring. And polls do not equal elections. Harry Truman is the classic example. When he was running for president, and on the eve of the election, the newspapers printed their papers early, and they said that the other guy won. Humphrey wins, and then you have a picture, a very famous picture of Harry Truman standing triumphant as the victor of the election, holding a newspaper that says Humphrey wins. Polls do not equal elections. All right, so knowledge and info. Now, this should not be a surprise to you, but Americans are generally not well informed about the following things: government structure, policy, government officials, the Constitution, or the size of government. If you ask them who the vice president is, many people will not know. But if you ask them what Brangelina is doing this week, you will get much more enthusiastic and well-informed responses. This is depressing, to say the least. However, it is something that can be fixed. But the problem is Americans are not well-informed about these items. And if you want to know why our government isn't working so well, look in the mirror. Or tell your parents to look in the mirror. Or tell the rest of America to look in the mirror. Because this is why we have the problems we have. Because we don't know about these things. That's it for part 2 of public opinion. I hope you learned what you need to, and I will see you next time.